Welcome, everybody, to our 2024 International Women's Day webinar. My name is Ji-Yeon Yuh, and I am your moderator for this event. I'm so pleased to see all of you, albeit virtually. The situation on the Korean Peninsula is always precarious, but these days it seems to be even more so. Multiple conflicts have erupted around the world again. And so in recognition of International Women's Day, Cross DMZ has invited renowned feminist scholar activists whose work sheds light on the gendered impact of the Korean War and on the role of women to advance peace and justice. So let me introduce our panelists today. Na-Young Lee is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Chung-Ang University in Seoul, and she is the chair of the board at the Korean Council for the Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan. Her research interests include post-colonialism, gender nationalism, sexuality, and transnational women's movements. Her recent publications include Multiple Encounters and Reconstructed Identities, Halmani Activist Survivors of Japanese Military Sexual Slavery as Post-Colonial Subjects, Challenging the Global Human Rights Regime, Transnational Significance of the Comfort Women, Redress Movement, and also Unforgettable Histories of U.S. Camptown Prostitution in South Korea, Women's Experiences of Sexual Labor and Government Policies. Our second panelist, Suzy Kim, is a historian and author of Among Women Across Worlds, North Korea in the Global Cold War, a book published by Cornell University Press last year. She teaches at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and she is the senior editor of Positions, Asia Critique, and serves on the editorial board of 여성과 역사, Women and History, the journal of the Korean Association of Women's History. As a public scholar, she has been an advocate for social justice and peace in Korea as a founding member of Women Cross DMZ. Let me quickly go through sort of what you'll be experiencing today. Professor Kim will give a short presentation on the International Women's Delegation during the Korean War. And Professor Na-Young Lee will give a short presentation on Camptown issues and the court ruling that was a real victory for Camptown activists and survivors of Camptown sexual labor. After that, we are going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A. And then we will have a short sort of announcement about Korea Peace Advocacy Week. Throughout this, I would invite you to put in your questions for the Q&A in the question box for our two panelists to consider. So our first panelist, Professor Suzy Kim.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining from wherever you're joining. I'm just going to share my screen with my presentation now. Everything looks okay? Yes. So the title of the webinar today is Gendered Impact of the Korean War, Past, Present, and Future. And given that I'm a historian, I'll be addressing the past, and I'll try to do it very quickly in about 10 minutes so that the next presenter can have a little bit more time since there's much more to cover in terms of the issues facing us in the contemporary moment. Since the webinar is in honor of International Women's Day, I actually wanted to start by tracing a little bit of the history of International Women's Day and some of the problematic ways in which it is actually spoken about today. So if you look at, this is a screen capture of the UN, the United Nations website on the history of the International Women's Day. And you'll notice right at the bottom there, it talks about the first few key years of the movement, and then it jumps to now. And if you actually click on that button that says now, it jumps to essentially 1975, which is the year that the United Nations designated as International Women's Year. And if you actually look here, just below, just above the yearly tabs, it says that the United Nations recognized International Women's Day only in 1977 officially. And if you look at some other websites that allegedly celebrate International Women's Day, like this one, internationalwomensday.com, and you click on the chronology, there's this really stark jump that is made from 1917 to 1975. So when I teach my gender and social change class at Rutgers, I oftentimes use this and basically ask my students to think about what is going on here. Why is the history all of a sudden between 1917 and 1975 making this huge jump, and what's happening in those years? And the short end of the answer essentially is that because throughout the Cold War, if you look at 1917 here, it basically says that, you know, the Russian women began a strike for bread and peace in 1917 on International Women's Day, which essentially launched the Russian Revolution that year. And so after that, International Women's Day essentially becomes a socialist, major socialist holiday that is celebrated throughout the socialist bloc. But of course, given that that is happening on the so-called other side of the Iron Curtain, in the vast majority of the so-called first world or the Western world, International Women's Day is not actually celebrated until the 1970s. But throughout much of that time, the missing decades, if you will, socialist women and communist women throughout the world were celebrating International Women's Day annually, and spearheading the initiative within the United Nations to mark not only International Women's Day, but, you know, designating 1975 as International Women's Year, was actually Women's International Democratic Federation, which was an international organization that was formed in Paris in 1945, just shortly after the end of World War II. And the impetus for founding this organization really came about because of this desire for seeing an active women's role within the peace movement. Many of the women that started this organization were anti-fascists fighting against fascism during World War II. And so, you know, many of them experienced what war, the horrible impact of the war on women and children and on families. And so they didn't want to see a repeat of another global conflict, such as World War II. And so they thought about elevating women's rights as a way to ensure women's roles within international politics and making sure that, you know, there was peace, a stable peace. Because one of the ways in which they explain the causes of war as being the result of imperialism and colonial exploitation by the major powers in the world, they took a very strong anti-imperialist, anti-colonial stance from the very beginning of their founding. And for that reason, they called out the French government. They were based in Paris, so they called out the French government for their policies in Vietnam. And for that reason, they were expelled by the French government. And in 1951, they had to relocate to East Berlin. But as we all know, the Korean War, the official start of the Korean War is 1950. And so in that same year as that they're expulsed from Paris, they decide to send a delegation of women to Korea to investigate potential war crimes during the Korean War. And the reason why they were able to spearhead this initiative was because the Korean women were actually part of the Women's International Democratic Federation through the Korean Democratic Women's Union. And I just wanted to, there's a very long history of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, which is the main umbrella women's group within North Korea that still exists to this day. But they were first formed at the end of, shortly, what was that? November of 1945. And this is one of the covers of the women's magazine that the Women's Union issued starting in 1946. This is an issue that was published in July of 1947 in celebration of the one-year anniversary of the gender equality law or the sex equality law that was passed in North Korea in those years when there was essentially a social revolution that really spearheaded many of the social reforms within North Korea before the Korean War. Without going too much into detail about this image, what I really find important, particularly about this image, is because the woman that is, I don't know if you can tell, but she is standing atop a globe here. And on that globe is a very large representation of the Korean Peninsula. And she is standing on the northern part of that peninsula, obviously representing the fact that she is from North Korea. And then you'll see this chain extending into the southern zone, at the time occupied by the United States. And I think the implication essentially here is that there is no comparable legislation passed in the South that guaranteed equal rights for women. And so the idea is that, you know, the Women's Union that was so key in passing this legislation would have to lead the Southern women also to their liberation eventually. She's holding a flag here with the acronym for the Korean Democratic Women's Union to represent their union there. So the Korean Women's Union was instrumental in inviting the delegation from commissioned by the Women's International Democratic Federation. And there were 21 women from 17 countries across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe that composed this commission. And they traveled to Korea under very dangerous conditions, given that this was at the height of the Korean War in 1951. They essentially had to travel by the cover of night in order to make sure that they were not bombarded by the US air campaign during the war. And they stayed about 10 days within North Korea, traveling to various parts of the country that were affected by the war. And they published this report that you see the cover of here. And what's really remarkable about this report is that, you know, in centering the experiences of women, they were calling out the impact of the war on women and actually explicitly included examples and cases of sexual violence. And I think when we think about the fact, and I think the next panelist, Professor Lee, will be talking about issues around camp towns and the comfort women for US troops. But if we think about the fact that sexual violence and rape as a war crime was not actually talked about within UN forums until the early 1990s, when the issue of, you know, Japanese imperial sexual slavery came about, with the first testimonies coming out in 1991, this is actually very remarkable that in 1951 already, this particular report made note of the cases of sexual violence and called out the US forces and UN forces for violating women's rights in this way. The two women that were leaders in the North Korean women's movement that were instrumental in inviting the international delegation was Park Jung-ae and Ho Jung-soo. Their cohorts, you know, essentially born in the first decade of the 20th century. There's a question mark about when Park Jung-ae dies, because there is no kind of published record or published obituary of when she dies. There's it's widely believed that she was essentially purged. She fell out of favor from the government sometime in the 1960s, and so you don't see her after that in the publications there. But if you compare the experiences of these two leaders, it's quite remarkable. Park Jung-hye studies in Moscow and is a major labor organizer during the Japanese occupation of Korea in the 1920s and 30s. And then she resurfaces after I wasn't able to find very much on her after that, but she resurfaces in 1945 when Korea is liberated and becomes the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, and she is the head of that organization for 20 years until 1965. Ho Jung-soo, she studies briefly at, I think, the Columbia Teachers College sometime in the 1920s in New York, and becomes kind of a very celebrated so-called red feminist. She was also known as Kollontai of Korea because, very much like Alexandra Kollontai of Russia, she called for free love and free sexuality, that women should not be, tied to their families in the conventional ways in which they were. And she becomes the most highest ranking female cabinet member in the first North Korean government as the Minister of Culture. I'll just end with some brief, some of the photos and archival material that I found recording the international women's delegations to North Korea during the war. Here you already see just how devastated North Korea was subjected to the bombing by the US bombing campaign. And you see the women's delegation there in the foreground. You see just how devastating the war conditions were at the time. Here, there were mass graves that the women visited to document civilian massacres at the time. And what I just wanted to note was that the women, some of the war photography that you might see through other means, like military records and whatnot, don't necessarily always demonstrate the ways in which, these kinds of delegations share the same space, they share the same kind of precarity and vulnerability, and were able to take their stories back to tell the wider world about that. You see here, the Cuban delegate trying to console one of the Korean women that was affected by the war. Here, it's the same Cuban delegate who is so affected, I think, by the story that she's also weeping with the Korean woman. You see the delegate members holding on to the other, physically trying to console them. They cry with them. And then at the end of their trip, they convene basically to try to come together for a consensus report, the cover of which you saw earlier. And I just want to end with this, just signaling why the women risked their lives to actually go to visit Korea during the height of the war. It was for international solidarity and peace. And in one of the events at the end of their trip, they basically shared gifts that they had brought. So in the top photo, you see gifts from the Korean women, Korean embroidery that they gave to the international delegation. And then on the bottom, you see one of the flags that I think the British delegate brought for the Korean women. And I think there's a lot to be learned from these experiences of the past insofar as, international solidarity now to try to intervene in the various conflicts that are waging around us is very important. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Professor Kim. Our next panelist is Professor Lee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ji-Yeon Yuh from Chung-Ang University and the Korean Council. Let me share my slide. Okay. The title of my presentation is A Lawsuit Filed by the South Korean U.S. Military Camptown Ji-Yeon in Korean, come for women against the South Korean government. I will explore the meaning of the lawsuit case and remaining task. On September 29, 2022, the Supreme Court of the Republic of Korea made a historic ruling for women's human rights. It finally acknowledged the Korean government's responsibility for the comfort women system in U.S. military camp towns. This was a great achievement 8 years after the victims filed the lawsuit and 10 years after the Ji-Yeon Women's Human Rights Coalition was formed. On the day of ruling, related organizations with victims held a press conference in front of the Supreme Court and announced, quote, "This will be recorded as a historic day when the Korean judiciary officially and finally recognized the state responsibility for the U.S. military comfort women, that the state committed violence and infringed on the human rights." On June 25, 2014, the lawsuit was filed by 122 plaintiffs of U.S. military comfort women, incorporated with the Camptown Women's Human Rights Coalition, a coalition of women's rights field groups, including Sunshine Social Welfare Society, in Korean, 햇살 사회복지회, 두레방, and researchers, including me, the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, and 세움터, and the Joint Defense Lawyers Team for the stated compensation lawsuit. The plaintiff included women who were used as comfort women for prostitution by U.S. soldiers in camp towns located in various regions of South Korea from 1957 to 2008. The defendant was the Republic of Korea, accused of violating the plaintiff's human rights by creating and managing camp towns and encouraging prostitution and being responsible for compensation for damages. The first trial ruling was made on January 20, 2017, 2 years and 6 months later. The second trial proceeded with both the plaintiff and the defendant appealing their respective losses, and the ruling was made on February 8, 2018. 4 years and 6 months later, finally, the Supreme Court finalized the second trial ruling. Although there are many limitations and disaffection at some point, the Supreme Court ruling is significant in many ways. First, for the first time, it was officially acknowledged that the state intervened in the process of operating, managing, and justifying prostitution in camp towns, and that women's human rights were violated as a result. In other words, the ruling acknowledged the illegality of the state actively promoting and justifying prostitution in camp towns. And for this purpose, directly educated women in the name of patriotic education, and despite having no legal basis, organized and used violent methods such as forced STD screening and quarantine. The court stated the plaintiffs suffered mental damages as their personal rights and human dignity were violated. Second, women's experiences became the standard for judging illegality and the basis for legal compensation. In the absence of many public record, plaintiffs submitted the experiences of harm through oral information or statement in court. The court recognized that as reliable evidences. In other words, the voices of victims who had been silenced for a long time in South Korea were now heard in the public sphere, challenging male-centered history through their experiences. Third, it confirms universal and international human rights values and clarifies the state's responsibility without limitation. The ruling acknowledged that prostitution goes beyond the dichotomy of voluntary versus forced, and that it is a structural problem that violated human dignity. The fact that it was determined that there is no statute of limitations on such serious human rights violation has significant implications for the Japanese government in dealing with the Japanese military comfort woman issue. Fourth, this ruling is not only the victory of victims, but also victory of a women's movement. The combination of the courageous victims and the history of victim support activities by field organizations such as Durebang, established in 1986, Sunshine Social Welfare Association, 햇살사회 복지회, established in 2002, and the consistent legal response activities of Ji-Yeon Camptown Women's Human Rights Solidarity, launched in 2012, have brought this win. The driving forces of Korean progressive women's movement, which grew along with the democratization movement in the 1980s, and the movement to resolve the issues of Japanese military comfort women, starting in 1990, have raised civic awareness and increased human rights sensitivity toward gender equality, including sexual violence against women and also wartime violation. Lastly, the most significant meaning of the lawsuit and the winning ruling is that it awakened us from collective forgetfulness and historical distortion. The stories of those women who were hidden in the matrix of silence, but occasionally emerged. The trauma amplified through repeated acts of denial and negativity, and the stories that those women had embodied with their whole bodies, but were not publicly recognized, were now engraved in the courtroom. We can affirm and face the social trauma that have continued since the Japanese colonial period. We had the opportunity to look once again at the contradictions of the Republic of Korea, where the ideologies of imperialism, colonialism, militarism, patriarchy, racism, and gender sexuality are intertwined. In this process, not only Korean judiciary, but also Korean society as a whole grew by a small margin, resulting in a victory in the first trial of a lawsuit filed by victims of a Vietnam War perpetrated by the Korean soldiers, and a favorable ruling in a lawsuit claiming compensation against the Japanese government, filed by victims of a Japanese military comfort woman. Now that we have opened a large and heavy door with difficulty, the task left to us is by no means light. There are several ordinances enacted by regional government, but still there is no actual state support for victims. Since the judiciary of the Republic of Korea has acknowledged the national responsibility, the legislative, executive branches must step forward and establish law and systems to support victims and to uncover the truth of U.S. military camptown. It has already been confirmed that prostitution in U.S. military camptown is not simply a problem of the past, and although there may be differences in subject and contents, it was conceived from the same root as the Japanese military sexual slavery system. So there is no reason to delay legislation to resolve the fundamental problem of U.S. military camptown in South Korea. Recording and remembering the U.S. military camptown cannot be postponed. We need to gather scattered record and the materials and systematically record the testimonies of victims. It is also urgent to preserve the buildings of sexually transmitted disease clinics and the women's organizations. For example, in the case of Durebang, the clinic building, this picture is Durebang. The clinic building that used to test and manage sexually transmitted diseases for women in Camptown has been used as a counseling center of Durebang office for over 37 years. This place has a special meaning as a place where the joys, sorrows, recovery, and hopes of the women of the former Camptowns are engraved in layers. In fact, this building is the history of Camptown itself. However, recently they have been urged to relocate it under the name of 샛들 마을 사업. It's like a renovated building project. Accordingly, the organization belonging to the Ji-Yeon Camptown Women's Human Rights Coalition are seeking solution together, but I don't think we have a good future for this one. But fortunately, in the case of a Sunshine Social Welfare Society in Anjeongni, Pyeongtaek, this picture, it was possible to open Ji-Yeon Women's Peace Museum in November 2021, thanks to citizens fundraising, volunteer work, and a special donation from victims. Where is the country in the construction of a memory space for future generation? Second, the expanding US-Japan ROK military alliance and shaky peace in East Asia is problematic. While Japanese and South Korean government are actively responding to the new Cold War confrontation policy of the United States, the trend of strengthening the ROK US-Japan military alliance, which is intensifying conflict and attention on the Korean Peninsula and in the region. The so-called extended deterrence strategy policy mobilizes South Korea's conventional forces in line with the US nuclear strategy, and the ROK US Nuclear Consultative Group was formed. Cooperation between the three countries was strengthened to the level of a quasi-alliance, including regular military training, information sharing, and the establishment of various consultative bodies. For this purpose, colonial Japan's history and victims' human rights were traded. For example, so-called third-party compensation for forced labors and the compliance with the 2015 Korea-Japan agreement regarding Kung-Fu women. To shift the burden of its own military power, the United States is encouraging South Korea to sell weapons to Ukraine, to increase war drills, and to strengthen interpolability. South Korea conservatives are using this as a hardline policy against North Korea. North Korea's hardline responses to this has reached its peak as well. And now South and North Korea are completely struck in a relationship between two hostile countries, rather than an inter-Korean relationship or a compatriot relationship. More than ever before, the influence of former imperialist, colonial, and militaristic countries is expanding on the Korean Peninsula, resulting in conflicts in border areas and the risk of war in East Asia. And third, retreat of equality and deteriorated human rights are very, very severe. While the Yoon Suk-yeol administration focuses on military confrontation and humiliating diplomacy with Japan and the United States, Women's and gender equality policies are disappearing. In a country that ranked last in the glass ceiling index among OECD countries and ranked first in the gender wage gap for 26 years among OECD countries. The existence of structural gender discrimination has been denied. Yoon Suk-yeol administration is neglecting its responsibilities for gender equality, such as by cutting the budget for the prevention of domestic violence and sexual violence, cutting the entire budget for sexual human rights education, and abolishing civic employment equality counseling centers. Even after the United Nations expresses concern several times, the Yoon administration eventually reduced the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. So now the ministry is on the path to extinction. The Yoon administration fundamentally undermined the values of national pride, national liberation, democracy, and peace that citizens worked hard to cultivate, demonized and oppressed the labor union, the media, and progressive civil society, and even sold the dignity and honor of victims in the name of improving Korea-Japan relations. As a result, the activities of the far right-wing group, right next to the weekly Wednesday demonstration, have skyrocketed. Misogyny and minority hatred have spread throughout our country, and gender violence has not stopped. Women's lives have become more difficult, their labor rights are threatened, and their human rights are being brutally tempered. Nevertheless, the Yoon Suk-yeol regime seems to be using it as a ruling strategy to divide the people, divide between men and women, divide between the strong and weak, divide between the rich and the poor, inciting hostility, conflict, and hatred. South Korea has the world's lowest birth rate. I think this is related to this severe reality. With the decolonization and the end of the Cold War still far away, the extreme right-wing, anti-human rights, and anti-woman policies of Yoon Suk-yeol administrations are regressing history, retreating democracy, and shaking human rights to their roots. Nevertheless, we must not give up hope for a better world. March 8 is International Women's Day. It is a day to commemorate the history of women who took the stand for freedom and equality, shouting for the right to survive, work, and vote, and pledged to take actions. They challenged the male-dominated society, the history of those in power, and exploitative capitalism, and fought for liberation from discrimination and neglect. Since then, dreaming of transforming politics, economy, culture, and history as a whole, women have advanced toward equal participation, fair distribution, democracy, and human rights. Despite all kinds of insurgent attacks, women proudly declared, "I am a feminist," and moved forward vigorously for a world without gender discrimination, sexual violence, labor exploitation, and sexual exploitation. It is time for us to stand up once again for the next generation, engraving in our heart the courage of victims and the passion of our predecessors who bravely went out into the world despite silence and oppression, and ultimately held the perpetrators accountable. Women living in imperialist, advanced capitalist countries, what and how will we practice here and now to fulfill our political responsibility? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, and also Professor Kim, for your presentations tonight. We are now in the Q&A portion of our event. And I want to start off by asking a question, trying to make some connections between the histories that our two presenters have given us. So first, for Professor Kim, if you can talk a little bit about what do you see as the legacy of the fact-finding mission in 1951 during the Korean War? I know that that report is something that you uncovered, that it really has been lost to historians and, of course, the general public. But I know also that you've been researching this, thinking about this history, and so I'd like to know a little bit about your thoughts on the legacy of this fact-finding mission for Korean women, but also for women globally.
Thanks so much for that question. I feel like I really had to rush through my own presentation, and I don't remember anymore what I said or not said. I cannot take credit for discovering that report. As you might have been able to guess, there was a library kind of code stamped on it. That particular copy, I think, is the one at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, but there's various copies in different languages that are available if you are careful to look for it, and there are others that had seen it before. And in fact, I was looking at it recently. John Halliday and Bruce Cummings' picture book on the Korean War, I think it's called Korea, The Unknown War, that came out in the late 80s. Is one of the very few books on the Korean War that actually even mentions the women's delegation, although it does not refer to the report itself. And it's actually really curious, most of the historiography on the Korean War, I think at best, the Women's Commission is a footnote if it appears at all, and most of them don't go into any detail. The legacy of the fact-finding commission, I think for me, would be just the fact that the women were attuned to the fact that there are gendered impacts of war that went without attention previously. So, they were very careful to note the ways in which women were sexually exploited and violated, and documented that in detail in the report, some of which is very difficult to read. It's so explicit. And the report, despite that, so the report was crafted and then it was sent along to the United Nations as a formal report that they wanted the United Nations to investigate and look into, and yet it was disregarded because this was being sent at the, as the Cold War is on the ascendance, and of course within the United States, it was a time of, the McCarthy era. So the report ends up being dismissed as political propaganda, and it didn't help, of course, that on the Soviet side and those countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union were very much calling attention to this report. So for all these reasons, and it bears reminding that the Women's International Democratic Federation that sponsored the women's delegation was pro-Soviet, and so they were left-leaning. They were many of them, identified with socialist and communist parties, and so for that reason, despite the fact that the composition of the delegation was actually quite diverse, the report ends up completely getting sidelined. But I think in some ways, the push for International Women's Year and, for the UN to recognize even International Women's Day came from, the socialist bloc. And so I don't think we can draw a direct line, but the efforts that were made starting with this report and calling attention to the impact of war on women specifically, I think laid the groundwork for some of these other things that came later, and namely the ones that Professor Lee was talking about, about kind of the continuity between the Japanese imperial system of sexual slavery, and then onto the ways in which sex becomes militarized in these ways and used within camp towns, around camp towns.
Thank you so much for that. My next question is for Professor Lee, and what was striking to a lot of people about the lawsuit that you so wonderfully explained is that it really holds the South Korean government accountable for militarized prostitution. And in a way, that's a slightly different narrative from the one that used to be more conventional, which was that the United States imposed this on Korea, and Korea, all of Korea, is a victim. And what this lawsuit is saying is, well, yes, but also South Korea has a responsibility, and it reneged on that responsibility to its citizens to protect them and to protect their human rights, and instead basically offer them up. And I'm wondering if what you can tell us about the effect of this lawsuit on activists in other countries that have also experienced this kind of US and local government sponsored militarized prostitution around American military bases. So I'm thinking about Okinawa in Japan, I'm thinking about the Philippines. What kind of movement is going on in those countries that is related to what has been happening in South Korea?
Unfortunately, I don't think other organizations in other countries where U.S. military bases are located have a further action plan regarding lawsuit against the U.S. military or U.S. government or regional government. I haven't heard about that actually. I think because of a weak activism in that region, even though several scholars who have been working on it and also individual activists who have been working on it, but still I don't think there is systematic organizations there. So because of that. And also, we examined before the lawsuit against South Korea, we examined the lawsuit against the US military or US government. But our lawyer just said that there's no one case to get a victory against the US military or US government regarding that issue. So at that time, our plan, the first one to achieve the victory against the Korean government, and then we can go further. So we are thinking about the lawsuit against the U.S. military or U.S. government.
Yeah, that's
to advance.
Yeah, that's a really important thing, right? The next step is to hold the American government responsible for militarized prostitution, militarized sexual labor. From the audience, we have a question from Liz Sohn, who is a professor at Northwestern and herself has done scholarship on comfort women survivors and their activism. And she writes, "Thank you for your illuminating talks, Professor Lee and Professor Kim. It's great to see everyone. This is a question for Professor Lee. Could you tell us about the activism supporting Filipino migrant entertainers trafficked into Korea and how organizations like Tudaebang and the Korean Council have worked in solidarity with organizations supporting Filipino migrant entertainers?" just to add to that question for people in the audience who might not be quite familiar, many of the people working in Camptown areas are no longer ethnic Korean women, but instead are ethnic women from other countries who have been trafficked into Korea for this kind of sexual labor. And so the Camptown prostitution, quote unquote, has undergone significant demographic changes. And that also has meant significant changes in how local feminist activists have, interacted with the whole issue and the kinds of activities that they've been able to do. So this is really a terrific question.
Another change in U.S. military Camptown in South Korea is Camptown prostitution itself is decreasing because U.S. soldiers go out for prostitution to other places like Itaewon and Hongdae, other places instead of Camptown itself. So, and the prostitution industry is shrinking in the Camptown. And also, as you said, Ji-Yeon, Professor Yuh said, so demographic changes is huge. And instead of Korean women, the Filipinas and other Asian women are working there. So for the Filipino woman, there is a Durebang in Pyeongtaek branch. It's kind of branch and another counseling center for migrant women, including Filipina. So they are supporting Filipina women. And also Korean Council has a butterfly fund. Butterfly fund means which is launched in 2012. The Comfort Women, for example, Kim Bok-dong and Ki-ron-oh want to support other victims in armed conflict or enforced prostitution. So we already send kind of money and regular money to Congo, Uganda, Vietnam, currently Palestine, to support women and children to survive. And also sometimes we support Gi-Ji-chon women in need. So we are interconnected structurally and systematically. And also, Korean Council is a part of the Gi-Ji-chon 여성 인권연대 itself. So closely connected each other. Actually, Kim Bok-dong and Ki-ron-oh went to the Pyeongtaek area to meet Camptown Comfort women and to encourage them and to file lawsuit against the Korean government. And they meet each other. And so they called each other 언니 and sister. So they got a kind of, sisterhood at the time. It was very touching. So, I mean, the Korean Council and activism regarding the U.S. military Camptown is very, very closely related.
Thank you.
I think it is an answer for that.
Yeah. Well, we are at the 55-minute mark, which means that unfortunately we need to close our Q&A session. Please reach out to our two panelists and also to Women Cross DMZ with your further comments and questions. They are most certainly welcome, and I'm very sorry that we don't have fulsome amount of time to really address all the many questions that I'm sure all of you have. I'd like to turn this over now to a Women Cross DMZ and for a brief announcement about Korea Peace Advocacy Week.
Thank you, Ji-Yeon, and thank you all the panelists for a great webinar tonight. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to highlight our annual Korea Peace Advocacy Week. So each year, Korea Peace Advocacy Week brings together hundreds of people around the country to participate in meetings with their members of Congress to advocate for legislation supporting peace in Korea. This year is our 9th year coordinating advocacy days for Korea Peace, and 5th year being held online. We just closed the registration on Monday, so we're not taking any more registrations, but I wanted to share some numbers with you since we closed the registration. We have 210 people participating and registered this year, around 32 states. And we are meeting with 175 offices in the House and the Senate. It's crucial to build support to officially end the Korean War. We must continue to tell our stories and make our voices heard to our elected officials. The main bill we're advocating this year is HR 1369, Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which calls for serious, urgent diplomacy in pursuit of binding peace agreement to formally end the Korean War. It requires a report from the Secretary of State describing a clear roadmap for achieving a permanent peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. And the bill expresses the sense of Congress that the Secretary of State should seek to enter negotiations with North Korea to establish liaison offices in each country's capital. And it requires the Secretary of State to conduct a full review of the travel restriction to North Korea and submit a report to Congress outlining qualifying criteria for exemption to the restriction, specifically or especially for those wishing to return to North Korea for family-related events. The bill currently has 39 co-sponsors, including Brett Sherman, who introduced the bill, and 2 Republicans. In 2019, Representative Ro Khanna of California introduced HRS 152, which was the very first congressional resolution calling for an end to the Korean War with the peace agreement, which had 52 co-sponsors. And Brad Sherman in 2021 introduced the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which ended with 46 co-sponsors at the end of the congressional session. And now he reintroduced the same bill now with the bill number HR 1369, which was introduced last year, March 1st. And we're aiming to reach at least 46 co-sponsors by end of this year or more. And that's why this year's Advocacy Week is very, very important. This year's Korea Peace Advocacy Week is being organized by American Friends Services Committee, Korea Peace Now, Church and Society and Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church, and my organization, Women Cross DMZ. Although the registration to participate is closed, I'll post a link in the chat so that you can click it and send right to your member of Congress and urge them to support Korea Peace. And I hope you to share this link with your neighbors, your friends. This week and next week, the Advocacy Week is actually going to take place from March 18th through 22nd. So I urge you to share this link the week of the Advocacy Week. Let's advocate. We need to educate and organize for peace in Korea. 71 years is too long. End the Korean War. Korea peace now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to Women Cross DMZ for holding this and organizing this event in commemoration of International Women's Day. And also, thank you to all of you out there who took an hour of your time to hear our presenters, ask questions, to reflect and think on these issues and this history, and who have been really stalwart supporters of peace and reunification for Korea and for everybody else who understands the sufferings that war brings to us, not only during outright hostility itself, but even after the end of the battles. Much love and peace to all of you, and we will see you next time.
See you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.